Hey everybody, welcome back to this week's video for our ongoing exploration through the story by Randy Frazee. This week we are looking at chapter 17, which is entitled The Kingdom's Fall. Now, if you have been keeping up with what we've had before, this one is probably going to sound very, very familiar, both in terms of its general themes as well as the sort of structure. It's very, very similar to what we had last week in chapter 16. Now we see a combo within the writing itself, a combination of both narrative as well as prophetic writings. That was again similar to what we saw in chapter 16. And really, in this time around here in chapter 17, we zero in on the closing portion of Judah as an independent kingdom before falling to the Babylonians. Now, initially, we hear a little bit of the influence, kind of perhaps the waning influence of the Assyrian Empire, which was prominent in chapter 16, and we're kind of seeing this sort of transition. Initially, we hear about several of the kings of Judah, the sort of the last kings of Judah, several generations, revealing back and forth regarding faithfulness in terms of how they act in accordance with faithfulness to God. Some of them are faithful, some are not. More often than not, they are not. More often than not, they're not. It's kind of funny. But we have that back and forth. Mostly they were unfaithful to God. Their stories are outlined and we find them scripture-wise in both Second Kings and Second Chronicles. Second Chronicles tends to give a little bit more detail, a little bit more narrative in terms of that activity with Assyria, especially in the opening portion that just sort of gets hinted at within what we read within in the book. It's about 6 generations of kings that's covering the period between the Assyrian exile or activity with Assyria and then moving into Babylon as Babylon comes into prominence and resulting in the destruction of Judah. Additionally, in addition to the narrative itself, the kind of the historical narrative, if we want to call it that, we also have the activity of 2 different prophets featured within this chapter. We have the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah, both of which are considered to be major prophets. We've talked about the distinction between major and minor prophets before. They're both considered to be major prophets because their writings are fairly extensive. What's interesting within their stories is that their stories or the books within the Bible that are attributed to them are also kind of that mix of both narrative and prophetic word as well. Sometimes we see a little bit more of that within the prophetic books than in others. Both of these have a fair amount of narrative mixed in with the divine word that they speak. Both are active in and around the exile with the Babylonians in terms of their time period. Ezekiel was let me back up just a little bit. What we actually see when we look at this section and these 2 different individuals is there were really 2 periods of Babylonian exile, or there were 2 separate periods when people were hauled off into exile that were about a decade apart, maybe just over a decade apart. Now, Ezekiel was in the first group actually taken off into exile, and this happened about the year 597 BC. This was when Babylon really came in and took control or showed their influence, and Judah became a vassal state for that roughly decade. But a first group of people were hauled off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So Ezekiel actually went to Babylon and settled there and then continued to be active as a prophet there in exile. The second group was in 586, so actually about 11 years later. And Jerusalem was also destroyed at this point because the puppet king that had been set up continued to rebel against Babylon, trying to free themselves from Babylon. So Babylon just came in and laid waste. Jeremiah was active in that decade between the 2 periods. He did not go into exile. However, he was among a group that fled to Egypt right before the destruction of Jerusalem. It's unclear whether or not he actually wanted to go, but he kind of indicates that maybe he was forced to go, but not really going into exile, more going into hiding, going the opposite direction from the opposing force. Both prophets were active about the same time, which is interesting that we have these two major prophets who were both active in about the same time, but they wrote from different perspectives, different messages about the same general events, which is certainly interesting to compare. Initially, both prophets were speaking a word of rebuke towards the nation and their unfaithfulness. However, Ezekiel, when he had gone into exile, his message really changed to one of hope, kind of. God gives him the message that 3 generations will pass and then I will send you back. So essentially, make yourself comfortable. You're going to live here. You're going to die here, but there is hope for the people. He receives words of restoration. We might even say resurrection for the people with the closing portion, and a story that I really appreciate, the Valley of the Dry Bones, which shows that we have a God capable of resurrection, even if that looks like different things. So that's Ezekiel. Jeremiah, though, on the other hand, oh, no, let me back up. Sorry. I'm trying to read my notes and I'm getting off topic. There is a theme within the Jewish culture, within the Jewish religion, within the Jewish nation, if we want to say that the promises of God are more communal than individual as we tend to see things. This is an echo of what we saw during the 400 years in Egypt, going clear back to the beginning of Exodus, where the promises of God are that I will raise up a deliverer for you, whether or not you actually live to see it. The promises are for the people. It is communal in nature, very, very much more so than we are. And we see that here with the message of Ezekiel as well, as I mentioned. 3 generations will pass. The promise is still there for the culture, for the people, not necessarily for you as an individual. And yet, as a member of this culture, you also share in that, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Looking ahead, as we think about historical things, this is really the end of the of Israel or Judah, or Israel and Judah being self-governed, with one brief exception that happened about 100 years before Jesus-ish, give or take, an event known as the Maccabean Revolution or the Maccabean Revolt. They are always a vassal. They are always controlled by someone else from this point forward, other than that one brief little section, and it really did not last very long. So that's kind of a look at where we're at historically. Now, I'm going to let you discuss what you actually read. Yet again, similar to last time around, I'm not going to go in depth to what's in there beyond what I've kind of already talked about, but I want to talk about things that, of course, I find problematic, make me go, and really, if we focus in on the story of Zedekiah, Zedekiah was the final king of Judah. Initially, he was set up as a vassal king to Babylon during that first portion, when the first group got hauled off into exile. He was set up as king. However, he didn't want to be a vassal king, so he eventually aligned himself with Egypt, tried to get back up from Egypt to try and free themselves from Babylon. Obviously, it did not work. The Babylonians come in and lay siege to Jerusalem again. This time they destroy it. They capture Zedekiah. And we hear that his punishment is actually somewhat of a common one at the time, something that we hear a lot through the scriptures, something that historically we just hear a lot about. And this oftentimes happens when a king is captured. And what happens is his sons or all of his children are killed in front of him. They make you watch your children being killed, so basically ending your bloodline, and then they put your eyes out. So the last thing that you ever see is the death of your children. After that, this happens to Zedekiah, and then he's taken off into exile. That's kind of the last we hear of him. But as I thought about that, it seems that this is the type of punishment that will also serve as a warning to others, aka defy us and we will wipe out your family and we're going to make you watch. When I think about that type of punishment, or the mentality behind that type of punishment, it also reminds me of the idea of crucifixion. Crucifixion by the Romans was also a punishment that served as a warning to others, like defy us and this is what will happen to you. This speaks to the reality of violence and control by force of might. It might work as a short-term deterrent, but ultimately it seems to fail every single time. Every empire that rises up, whether that batch that I talked about before with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, that all at various times one rises up and then the next one rises up and then the next one rises up. We see over and over and over again as we look at history that empires that may rise up also die off. And this should give us a little bit of pause. We live in a nation, a country that seems to be known as the richest and the strongest in the world right now. And what does history warn us about that? I'm not going to propose to you exactly what you should think about it, but it makes me go, And when I think about that we have this great military, we have this great show of might and power, oftentimes in many different places around the world, which I don't know, depending on your point of view, could be a good thing or a bad thing. But what does history show us when we try and just rely on power and strength? That it ultimately will fail. So what do we do with that? I'm going to let you talk about that, or at least think about it. That's everything I have. Hope you have a great discussion. We'll catch you next time.